Okay, pull this up. All right, welcome to our first lecture of the semester, The Authentic Shakespeare, or why it's important to get the required textbook instead of just reading whatever version of the play you find online. Okay, so with these lecture videos, I'm hoping to keep them fairly short, 20 minutes or under, but I can't make any promises because once I get started talking about this stuff, I just find it so fun and interesting and fascinating, and I might get carried away. So anyway, let's go ahead and get into this. When you pick up an edition of Shakespeare's plays, most of the time we assume that the play we're reading is Shakespeare's original and intended words, right? Um, After all, that's how publishing works today, right? An author writes their words down, they send their words to the publisher, and then the publisher, they do many rounds of revisions, but always with the author checking to make sure, yes, this is the way I want it said, this is the way I want it written, so that when it's printed, it's very clear that this is what the author intended. However, you should be aware that things worked very differently in Shakespeare's day. So we're going to talk about how Shakespeare wrote his plays. So, when Shakespeare first started writing, um, professional theaters were just beginning to become a thing, right? Before Shakespeare's time, most plays and dramas were done on makeshift stages by traveling troops who sort of traveled around. Like real permanent theaters were not so much of a thing before Shakespeare's time. They just started being built right around the 1570s to 1590s. So here we have a picture of the famous Globe Theater, Shakespeare's theater. Um, that this was the theater for the company that Shakespeare worked for. And this was built in 1599, so right as Shakespeare was writing some of his most popular plays. So it was a permanent place for them to perform their plays. So there were different acting companies, and they had a repertoire of plays. They had like um, a whole selection of plays that they would choose from, and they tried to uh, have as many new plays a year as they could. Um, and so these authors were just trying to pump out as many plays as they could to keep these daily performances going. They would perform every day, sometimes every night if they were indoor theaters with candles. Um, and the and these actors were just writing as many as they could um, for these playhouses. But troops were still traveling. So sometimes these plays would get taken on the road, and they'd go to Oxford or they'd go to some country town and the company would perform it there. Or most prestigiously, what we have pictured here, they would get to perform for the Queen. Um, so this is a makeshift stage set up in the throne room, and all the courtiers are here around watching, but of course the Queen gets the best seat in the house and the actors are performing. So all this means is that with all of these various performances, plays changed a lot from their conception throughout their runs, and they would be revived year after year and performed over and over again and performed in different places, and they could mutate quite a bit throughout all of these productions. Um, they could be edited for length so that they could be shorter or longer, or depending on who was acting at the time, what kind of actors the company had. They could cut parts or they would add parts in. So plays could change quite a bit from what the author first wrote. Okay, this right here is what we call a foul paper. So when a play was very first written, straight from the author's hand, that was called a manuscript. And we refer to these manuscripts as foul papers. So that's the very first copy that an author would produce of a play. So this example right here is actually from a Christopher Marlowe play called The Massacre at Paris. And you can sort of see that this one actually looks fairly clean. Sometimes they could be quite messy with scratching out and like notes added in the margin because, this is how they're composing the play at the very beginning. Once the foul papers were written, so once a first draft of the play was written, the play would be copied over and over and over again by hand. This was all done by hand. And all of those copies would get passed out to various people, the actors or the playhouse would keep a copy. They always had to submit a copy to the authorities to get approved because they censored plays back then. They were very interested in that sort of thing. So you could have multiple copies, manuscript copies of plays, and sometimes in the copying out or in the writing it out for different actors or whatever, things change too, right? And here's a really interesting and important thing to note. Like I said, this is an example of a Christopher Marlowe foul paper. We don't have any of Shakespeare's foul papers. We actually don't have a single one of his plays written in his hand in manuscript form at all. Um, and that's kind of a blow for those of us who really want the authorial Shakespeare because, most of us would think that this very first manuscript copy, that would be the original, the authorial Shakespeare, and we don't have any of that. We don't have anything in his handwriting. Another interesting note, some of the things we do have in his handwriting, there are lots of his signatures running around, several different versions of his signature all over the place. Shakespeare spelled his name differently every single time he wrote it. That's how spelling worked back then. It was very fluid. So actually, the way that we spell Shakespeare's name today, he never actually wrote that. We do not have a version of Shakespeare's name spelled Shakespeare in his own handwriting. I think that's just kind of a funny tidbit. Piece of trivia for you to throw out there. And if you want to know why we spell it this way, ask me sometime and I'll tell you. All right, so then, if we don't have any manuscript versions of Shakespeare's plays, how do we still have them at all? Well, because of this wonderful little invention called the printing press. All right, so after a play was performed, they would often send it to a printing press and have it printed to sell printed copies of it. Now, you can see here, the print house back in the day looked very different than it does today. All of the type had to be set by hand, and then they would ink it up and they'd put the paper on it and they'd make as many copies as they could. But if you see this little person over here, that's what he's doing. He's setting the type by hand, and they're working from a manuscript copy. But once again, just like with copying by hand, mistakes could be made. Often mistakes were made in printing too. So many of these early modern books have multiple printing errors in them, and they used to actually always include a list in the back of the book called a list of errors, where they acknowledge where all the printing mistakes were. So again, lots of mistakes were made here in the printing house when Shakespeare's plays went to print. In his lifetime, most of his plays did go to print in what were called quartos. Okay, so here's an example of a few quarto versions of Hamlet. So when plays went to print, you have to understand this era where the printing press is really new and where this explosion of playwriting is happening and them going to print is fairly new. It was sort of like the Wild West, okay? They didn't have copyright laws like we do now. Those were just starting to evolve. And so sometimes printers would steal the plays. They would get unauthorized copies from, say, an actor or something. Or there's even, they think sometimes that people would go to the plays and memorize them and then write them down for the printer, which we can't prove that actually happened, but it's sort of an interesting theory. So what we have today is various quartos, right, that were published in Shakespeare's time, various editions of these quartos that are all very different sometimes. So some of them are called bad quartos. This right here is Hamlet Q1, it's called Quarto 1, and it's considered a bad quarto because it's short and it doesn't include a lot of the famous things that we know from Hamlet, know and love, and they don't think that this one was authorized by Shakespeare himself. Then we have what are called good quartos, and these are ones that are considered to be approved either by the author or the company. The company actually owned the plays, not the author. The author's name would go on them, but the company owned the play and the company would authorize the printing of the play. So there's good quartos, there's bad quartos, there's in-between quartos. We don't really know what to do with most of these quartos, and we are just making guesses about which ones are authorized and which ones are plagiarized, and if that was even a thing back then. And if you remember, there were multiple versions of these plays being performed, so it's possible that the multiple versions in print were just different versions that had actually been on the stage at various times. It's really hard to know these things. So, 7 years after Shakespeare's death, a group of his friends got together and decided that what this great playwright needed was a authorized collection of his plays. So his friends got together and they collected as many versions of his plays as they could find, and they edited them all together, put them together, and we got what's called the first folio. All right, maybe you've heard of this because it's a really, really important book. Shakespeare's first folio. Now, in this collection of Shakespeare's plays, we have some new plays or some plays that would have been lost otherwise, as in we don't have quarto versions of them. We don't think that they were published in Shakespeare's lifetime. There's no manuscript version of them. So the only version of the play we have is what exists in the first folio, and that includes plays like Julius Caesar and Macbeth. We also have some plays that we have many quarto versions of, but they're very different. Like the first folio version is very different than the quarto plays that we have. And then, of course, there are some versions of the plays that are very similar to quarto versions and were probably published from the quarto version. So it's a very interesting mix, all these versions that we have of Shakespeare's plays. Now, I keep using these terms, quarto and folio, and I'll briefly explain what that means. It's talking about the size of the book, right? So you'll see these two books right here. These are quarto size. So they're kind of maybe the average size that you would expect a book to be. A little bit smaller, very readable, and this is the size of most of the plays that were printed in Shakespeare's lifetime. Now, the folios, these big boys are folios. And these are big, grandiose books, and sort of like our coffee table books these days. And they're just meant to inspire status or say, look, this is a really important author, so we're giving him a good, big book. So that's what I mean when I say folio and quarto. I'm talking about big books versus medium-sized books. And then there were other sizes too. That were smaller and whatnot. But most of the versions that we have of Shakespeare are either going to be quartos or from the big folio that was published in 1623. Okay, so for a long time, the folio, that 1623 folio, was the authoritative Shakespeare, right? For most of the 1600s and even through most of the 1700s, the folio was considered the authorial Shakespeare. The thing is, in the late 1700s, when Shakespeare started to become very popular and started becoming known as the English author, scholars started taking a look at the quartos again. And someone had the brilliant thought that, hey, why do we think that the book that was published 7 years after his death is more authorial than all of these quartos that were published in his lifetime when he may or may not have had input into them? So then they started looking at the quartos again, and they started saying maybe some of these quartos are more authorial and better. And so they came back into vogue. And then what we get is all of these different versions of Shakespeare, okay? So these new editions of collected works that started getting published. And this editor decided that he liked this quarto version and this folio version, and then maybe a mix of this quarto and this folio version, and they started basically just making their own collections of Shakespeare's, picking and choosing among the quartos and folios that existed. So every few years, a new edition of Shakespeare's collected works come out, and they're always different. They're always different because sometimes they value the quarto version, sometimes they value the folio version, and sometimes they totally mix them all together. So, an interesting fact about Hamlet here, I've got the bad quarto and the good quarto here, but there's also a folio version of Hamlet plus a few other quarto versions of Hamlet. There's lots of versions of Hamlet. But an interesting fact is that when we read Hamlet in a couple weeks here, we are not actually going to read a version that existed in Shakespeare's lifetime, or even shortly after his lifetime, because what most editors do now is they take a majority of sections from Q2, from the second quarto, and they add in some lines from the folio that aren't in it, and they mix them together. And there's very famous scenes and very famous lines from both those versions, and they mix them together, and that's the Hamlet that we know today. That's the Hamlet that we're familiar with. If we were to just read the quarto 2 version, we'd be like, hey, where's that famous speech? Or if we were to just read the folio version, we'd be like, oh, hey, wasn't this character supposed to say this? Yes. In the other version, it does. Anyway, so we mix them. So when we read Hamlet in a couple of weeks, we're going to be reading that mixed version that didn't ever actually exist in Shakespeare's lifetime. And that that's just like big picture stuff. There are so many nitpicky little differences between all of these versions as well. If you remember printer errors, if you remember just like all the different things that could have gone wrong, there's fights over words, what certain words are supposed to be. There's all sorts of debate about what is considered authorial, what Shakespeare would have intended or meant. And there's a long history of editors bashing it out and fighting over these questions. So anytime you pick up a version of Shakespeare's text, you're picking up a version that has been like argued over and fought over at the sentence and word level for literally centuries. People making decisions and fighting about what Shakespeare, what's the original and the authorial Shakespeare. And every version is different. So when I'm asking you to get specifically the Norton version of Shakespeare, it's because it's been edited in a certain way and it's been glossed in a certain way, and they've made very specific decisions about which words to include and which words not to include, and about which text they're drawing from, the quarto or the folio. They've made lots of decisions about these things. And just so we can all be on the same page, it's always best to read the same edition. The other thing I love about using the Norton is because in all of that online material in the ebook, they'll show you sometimes the different versions. They have the different Hamlets up there. They'll have the different versions of King Lear. Oh, King Lear. We're not reading King Lear this semester, but there are 2 entirely separate versions of King Lear out there, and both of them are considered authorized. Both of them are considered legitimate. And so when you read King Lear, you might be reading a completely different version than someone else. And someone else might start talking about the trial scene at the end of King Lear. And if that's not the version you read, you're going to have no idea what they're talking about. Anyway, all that aside, just saying, this is why it's sort of important to know what version of Shakespeare you're reading, because it might be entirely different than someone else's version. So, I'm asking you to read these Norton versions of these texts. Does that mean that I think the Norton is the authorial Shakespeare? Frankly, we have no idea. Frankly, no one has any idea what the authorial Shakespeare is. And here's another fun question to think about, or at least I think it's fun to think about. Would Shakespeare even care? Would Shakespeare even care what versions we were reading? Would he consider any of his versions to be authorial? And that sort of depends, the answer to that question sort of depends on this question that we talked a little bit about. Did Shakespeare write for performance, or did he write for print? Okay, so let's sort of think through some of these things, right? If you remember what I talked about with performance, right? These plays would have long runs on stage. They'd be taken on tour, different versions for different settings. They'd be revived years later and altered depending on what actors they had available, depending on what props they had available, depending on how long they wanted the play to be. So things got changed all the time. And Shakespeare was an actor himself. He acted with his company and he performed in some of his own plays. We have some records of that. So clearly, Shakespeare understood that plays needed to be changed for the different performances. He probably valued ad-libbing and there was lots of audience interaction back in the early modern period that was really prized. The audience would actually cheer and boo much louder than they do now, and actors would respond to the audience. So play performances could be very different even from one night to the next. So there's this sense that if Shakespeare was a man of the theater and a man of the stage, and if he was writing these plays for the stage, then he would embrace all of this diversity and he would love all these different versions, and every single one of these different versions could be authorial, right? And it could all be legitimate. The counter argument to that, of course, is that he was also a poet, right? And these plays were going into print in his lifetime, and that would have been a significant portion of Shakespeare's income. Shakespeare got money from people buying his books and reading them, and so he had a very vested interest in protecting his name and protecting his plays that went into print, and making sure that he was getting credit for the plays that went into print, and making sure that those plays were in fact his plays, right? His words. He didn't want his name slapped on some, shoddy, awful play. Um, he wanted it to be associated with his work, and as a poet, he would have cared. He probably would have cared very deeply about certain things being the same. Like certain rhymes or certain speeches being said the way he meant them to be said. Um, he read classic plays himself. That's how these playwrights grew up in schools, learning Latin and grammar by reading ancient classical playwrights and translating their works. And so he would have been very aware of debates over how the classic poets were being interpreted, and whether and the importance of what one word meant as far as changing different things in a play. So he probably definitely had opinions about these things, and wanted to be an author who was read like the classic poets of old were being read and studied. So he probably very much cared about his work going into print and being read. Um, so that's sort of where we stand right now, right? These sort of two camps, these two sides, this interesting, fascinating history of variation. So my question for you is, what do you think? What do you think about whether Shakespeare meant to be read, whether he meant to be seen in performance, and whether or not there is an authorial Shakespeare at all, and what we should do with that, with figuring out what kind of Shakespeare we're reading, or if we're reading Shakespeare at all. Yes, we are. We are reading Shakespeare was a real person, okay? We don't need to get into those debates, but yes, Shakespeare was a real person. Anyway, so feel free, if you found any of the information in this lecture to be interesting, to chime in with your thoughts and your comments on the discussion board for this week. And I'm excited to talk with you about some of these ideas throughout this semester.